To wrap our minds around everything we want to say about the Holy Spirit, there are sort of two steps we want to take. First of all, we want to think about the Spirit in God, and then we want to think about the Spirit in God's plan. So if we think about the Spirit in God, a helpful way to conceptualize this is to go to your standard diagram of the logical relations that make up the doctrine of the Trinity. Because to place the Spirit in God is to explicitly place the Spirit within the Trinity. Well, if you know the classical diagram I'm talking about, you put God in the middle because that's the divine nature. There's one God. And then you put Father, Son, and Spirit around that divine nature, not because you can count to four and say there are four things there. We're working on two different levels, but there's one God, one being, who exists eternally as Father and Son and Holy Spirit. And then, of course, you say that each of those is God, and yet they are not each other. Those dynamics give you the fact the Father is God, the Spirit is God, but the Father is not the Spirit. Working around those dynamics is really what gives us the conceptuality we need to think about the Spirit in God. So the first thing to say then, just to take the spoke of that diagram that says the Holy Spirit is God, just as the Father is God and the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God. What that means is we need to treat the Holy Spirit as divine. And we need to know that when we're doing pneumatology, we are doing the doctrine of God. We're not doing part of a doctrine about, we're not doing a part of a doctrine about how God works, about something that God does. And we're not doing 1/3 of the doctrine of God even. We're confessing the deity of the Holy Spirit, and that we deal with this, when we deal with this person, we're dealing with deity, God. One of the ways that God is he is God, the Holy Spirit. One temptation we want to avoid here is, I love that little diagram of the three persons of the Trinity being the one God. But as soon as you write Holy Spirit by one of the corners of that triangle, it can produce the sort of optical illusion that that third of the triangle sort of belongs to the Holy Spirit. And then that would mean that the Holy Spirit is 1/3 of God. And if you were to add together the third that the Spirit has and the third that the Father has and the third that the Son has, you'd end up with a complete God. But the persons of the Trinity are not 1/3 each of God to be added up to make a complete God. Each of the persons is fully God. You can't go through the divine attributes and say, some of these attributes, roughly 1/3, belong to the Spirit. No, all of them belong to the Spirit. So every thought you've ever had about a perfection or an attribute of God is a thought that is also about the Holy Spirit. Just, loving, omniscient, omnipotent, merciful, all of those things, they all apply to this person that we're talking about. Now, the other thing to say about placing the Holy Spirit in God in this way, with some help from the logical structure of Trinitarian theology, is it also means that the Holy Spirit is never separate from God the Father and God the Son. So the Spirit is God, but we can't just focus on the Holy Spirit and say, now I have every thought I ever need to have about God. Just because you're talking about the entire divine essence dwelling hypostatically in the Holy Spirit doesn't mean that you can say, don't talk to me about the Father. The persons of the Trinity are relationally constituted. They are who they are because of each other. That means you can never have the Spirit as a solo agent or as a consideration all by itself. It's always the Holy Spirit of the Father, even the Holy Spirit of God the Son. This is, I think, something we especially need to watch out for with the Holy Spirit for a couple of reasons. When you have the Father and the Son, almost anyone who's thinking remotely biblically knows that you can't have one without the other. When the disciples say to Jesus, show us the Father, Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Paul tells us in Colossians, he, Jesus Christ, is the image of the invisible God. We know that these two go together. There are a lot of reasons for this. I don't want to try to diagnose all of them, but for these reasons, the Holy Spirit seems to be someone that a lot of people feel like they can somehow pluck out of the Trinity and say, something is happening here which is maybe not to do with the Father or the Son, but has to do with the Holy Spirit, and it's different. You can maybe even see this in the fact that there's a whole field of books called spirituality, and it seems to be sort of generic, non-name brand spirituality. In the history of how books get titles and how categories get assigned, the word spirituality came out of Christian theology, and it meant something about holy spirituality. It meant something about the work and communion with the third person of the Trinity. The idea that there's some sort of plain generic spirituality is a little etymological hint that we think the Spirit is in some way separable from the Trinity. It's simply not true. The Spirit is never separate from God the Father and God the Son. The Spirit is relationally constituted in relation with the Father and the Son. Another way to see this is the metaphor of God always doing everything with the complete Trinity working outwardly. What I mean is, internally, the Father begets the Son and the Spirit proceeds from the Father, and not vice versa. The Son doesn't beget the Father. The Father doesn't proceed from the Spirit. These are sort of one-way relations that are distinct within the person of God. But everything God does outside the Trinity follows the rule that the external works of the Trinity are undivided, that everything that happens outside the Trinity is the whole Trinity, all three persons, working in the world toward us. Irenaeus of Lyon, a 2nd century theologian, used a homey little metaphor for this. He said, everything the Father does, he does with his two hands, the Son and the Spirit. He certainly does not mean that the Son and the Spirit are literally hands of the Father. He's talking about agency, that when the God acts, the Father does everything two-handedly, or the Father's always working through the Son and the Spirit to do everything. It's a helpful way of thinking about the undivided external actions of the Trinity. What this means is that when you're dealing with the Holy Spirit, you're dealing with God because you're getting the same thing in one sense. Not the same person, if you follow my meaning, but the same thing, the divine essence, the person of God. Well, all of this is background for what it means to place the Spirit in God. Using some of the conceptual tools of the doctrine of the Trinity, it keeps us from isolating or singling out the Spirit. It also keeps us from demoting the Spirit as if we're dealing with anything less than God when we talk. We'll also, of course, need to distinguish the Spirit clearly from the Father and the Son, but the only safe way to do that is to begin by making the affirmations we've just made. The Spirit is fully God, and you can't have the Spirit without also having the Father and the Son.